Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if learning a language completely different from your own could change how your brain works, especially if it got damaged? Well, this new study dives into just that. We all know that most language research, especially for brain conditions like aphasia, often looks at languages like English or Spanish. But what about languages that are organized in totally different ways? The researchers here are super curious about this. They point out that if we only study a few languages, we might accidentally think that language breakdown patterns are universal, when really they might just be specific to the languages we're looking at. This is a big deal because understanding how the brain handles language might depend a lot on how that language is built. For example, think about what we call telegram, like speech, where people leave out small words like prepositions or articles. This is often linked to a type of aphasia, but what does leaving out words even mean in a language where words are built in completely different ways, like adding lots of puzzle pieces together to make one giant word? That is where this study comes in. Looking at a language called Kalaallisut, also known as West Greenlandic. Kalaallisut is a language that is really unique because it is polysynthetic. Imagine building words by stacking a whole bunch of tiny meaning bits called morphemes. Together, you can keep adding them, making incredibly complex words, sometimes so complex they can even act like a whole sentence in English. This makes it a perfect testing ground to see how aphasia affects language when it is not structured like English at all. So, what did the researchers expect? They had a few hunches. First, they thought that people with aphasia would speak in shorter, slower bursts similar to what is seen in other languages. Second, and this is the really interesting part, they predicted that the building blocks of words, the morphology, would be more spared than the sentence structure, the syntax. It is like saying the Lego bricks might be okay, but putting them together into a complex structure is harder. And finally, they thought verbs might be especially tricky. To test this, they worked with 11 people who had non-fluent aphasia and 6 people who didn't, all speakers of Kalaallisut. They asked them to talk about things using pictures like the famous cookie theft picture, comic strips, and personal experiences like what it was like during the COVID-19 pandemic. They recorded all this speech, then meticulously transcribed and analyzed it, looking at all the tiny parts of the words and how they were put together. And what did they find? Well, their first hypothesis held up. People with aphasia definitely spoke slower, and in shorter utterances, both measured in words and in those meaning bits called morphemes. Their words were also a bit shorter, meaning they had fewer of those little meaning bits stuck together, which was a bit different from one earlier study but still showed a clear pattern. But here is where it gets really fascinating. When they looked at the structure of language, the researchers found that the syntax, or the sentence structure elements, showed bigger differences between the people with aphasia and the control group. For instance, those with aphasia used fewer complex sentence parts like subordinate verbs, and fewer utterances had a main verb at all. Now, what about the word building blocks? The morphology. This is where the neatest findings emerged. The study suggests that much of the word building, especially the part that changes the meaning or function of a word, called derivational morphology, seemed pretty well preserved. However, the endings that change verbs to show things like tense or who is doing the action, called inflectional morphology on verbs, showed less variety in the aphasia group. So, while the building pieces were mostly there, the variety of how they were used, especially on verbs, was less rich. And remember that idea about leaving out endings. The study found that the people with aphasia didn't systematically produce words without endings, which is pretty important in Kalaallisut. While there were a few instances of missing or incorrect endings, it wasn't the main problem and was far less common than other issues. So, what does this all mean? The researchers conclude that non-fluent aphasia in Kalaallisut speakers looks a lot like it does in other languages, slower, shorter, and syntactically simpler speech. But the morphology, the way words are built, appears to be relatively preserved. This challenges the idea that impaired functional morphology is a core feature of non-fluent aphasia across all languages. Their findings suggest that when people have aphasia in a complex language like Kalaallisut, the brain might prioritize keeping the word building mechanisms intact, even if it means simplifying the overall sentence structure. It is like saying the intricate details of how a car is built are less affected than how it's driven on the road. The researchers propose that these patterns are best explained by a theory that combines language structure and cognitive processes. The idea is that people with aphasia might unconsciously prioritize what is most essential for communication or what they can handle with their reduced cognitive resources. In Kalaallisut, This seems to mean preserving the core meaning of words and their internal structure, while simplifying how those words are arranged into sentences, or how certain verb endings are used with full variety. This study is really valuable because it expands our understanding of aphasia beyond the typical languages studied. It shows how incredibly diverse language breakdown can be depending on the unique structure of a language. For Kalaallisut speakers, it seems the sentence construction is more affected than the complex internal word building. It also highlights that what might be considered grammatical or lexical can be blurry, especially in highly morphological languages. The researchers suggest that elements like derivational affixes, which are word-building parts, might actually function more like vocabulary in how they are processed or affected by aphasia. One interesting point is that while they didn't expect omissions of inflectional endings, a few did occur, especially on verbs. This suggests that even in a well-preserved system, there can be subtle difficulties. Now, for the so what part? This research is crucial for developing better ways to diagnose and treat aphasia in speakers of diverse languages. If we know that certain aspects of morphology are more robust, we can focus our interventions on the areas that are more vulnerable, like syntax or specific types of verb inflection. It also nudges us to think more broadly about what grammar means across different human languages and how the brain might prioritize different linguistic components when damaged. What could come next? More research could explore how Kalaallisut speakers with different types of aphasia perform. We could also look at comprehension of these complex words and sentences. Understanding these nuances is key to making sure that language research and treatments are inclusive and effective for everyone, no matter their linguistic background. And that is a wrap on this fascinating exploration into aphasia and the incredible complexity of Kalaallisut. If you enjoyed this dive into the mind and language, please hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more brain-bending science. Until next time, stay curious.